might be in the big bad world. I am Chris Irons, Director of Strata Solve, independent strata consultancy firm. Alongside me, virtually anyway, Frank Higginson, partner, Hines Legal, industry expert. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone, from two different venues today.
Indeed, yes. So we have been spread to the winds today for various reasons. So I am appearing in sunny Gold Coast. Well, actually not sunny Gold Coast today. Frank, you're around in the relatively same area.
Yes, I'm at Talai, different place. Beach to the scrub.
Yes. Lots going on in Strata at the moment, and today's topic is a huge one at the moment, of course, unfortunately. Today it's all about natural disasters in Strata. Just a reminder to everybody too that when it comes to sorry, you've caught me a little bit on the hop, everybody. But just a reminder to everybody, if you're new to our show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 p.m. Brisbane time. So to follow us on Facebook, go to Hines Legal page and hit the like button and icon. For YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. As always, welcome questions and comments during the webinar today. If yours is a little more involved, it's a good idea to use the link that is in the comments, because that's a better way of getting a more kind of fulsome query happening. But as I say, Frank, today, really topical topic, really topical issue, and that's natural disasters in Strata. And it seems like the country, Frank, is consumed by natural disaster.
And it's climate change or otherwise. Leave that aside, so it's not political. We've got an election in May, who knows what will happen. But I know for me, I suppose there's two elements to this for me, is that what we're talking about today isn't so much about Queensland law, although there's a little bit of that in there. It's more about what happens to bodies corporate and dare I say owners corporations when things go wrong in a major way, because what we're talking about today, I think, is applicable across the country and probably across the world about strata issues. And the other thing that for me battled with a bit, I hate the prospect of being seen as an ambulance chaser. So this actually isn't about legal work. It's about helping people deal with things that are going horribly wrong. And that's my intent behind it. And the reality is that, and Chris, you'll be the same, we get a lot of phone calls when things go wrong. And dare I say it, Chris, the flooding stuff, the phone calls after the recent Brisbane floods are no different to the phone calls we had after the Townsville floods. And if I could remember back a decade or more ago, after the 2011 Brisbane floods, with things going wrong or having gone wrong. So today, I think, is almost a three-part process, isn't it? There's what you do now when things aren't wrong, what happens when you're in the middle of it, and what to do afterwards, how to look at things. Because it is, unfortunately, some of the stuff we deal with when things do go catastrophic, there is a catastrophe, are the same every time.
Yeah. As Frank, you said, we're going to try before, during, after approach when it comes to natural disasters in Strata during this broadcast. We appreciate that natural disasters are incredibly traumatic, regardless of where you are and what your impact of them is. We are focusing today solely on the Strata side of things, because that's what we know about. And that's not to denigrate anything else that anybody is feeling about it. Let's go on the before bit. So this is the scenario, the context in which you can start to think about how to plan for and mitigate against natural disasters without them actually happening, I suppose is what we're saying here. And Frank, the biggest thing, well, maybe not the biggest thing, but probably the biggest thing, is insurance, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is old faithful. And so the insurance market is, I think, what everyone's calling a hard market at the moment. It goes through ebbs and flows. I mean, insurers are there to make money. They're there to price risk. So they look at the prospect of something going wrong and price what the damage would be to them if that was going wrong, and adjust their premiums accordingly. So I think, well, there's a lot going on with insurance, and there has been, Chris, I think, for probably a couple of years now, hasn't there? I mean, in terms of where to start, I suppose the biggest thing is don't take your insurance policy for granted. Understand what is covered, what isn't covered, what your choices are, ask questions. And really for me, and this isn't being derogatory towards anyone who places a policy, brokers, advisors, or otherwise, ask them about the risks that you might face, because you never know what they might or might not know about your building and what might or might not be covered. And the thing for me that we get all the time is phone calls after events, and these are the ones where people are crying. I don't know too many people crying on the phone to me, thank goodness, where they've been wiped out and they have just found out that their insurance policy doesn't cover flood, and it's the first time they know about it.
Frank, I had an experience like that when I was commissioner. I was in Townsville for an event, and I had some people come up to me afterwards and tell me that same story. I thought we were covered for floods, and we're not. And it was really distressing stuff at the time, because they didn't feel like they had any way out. Their place had been destroyed, basically. And we're hearing those stories now as well. The assumption that our Strata scheme had flood insurance and it didn't, or the assumption that there was a particular kind of cover for flood insurance and it wasn't there, or it wasn't to the extent that we thought it was. Yeah, that's a tough situation if it's happening.
It is. And like for me, the lesson really from this, for everyone, no matter who you are in Strata, be you a body corporate manager or a committee member or a lot owner, from a lot owner's perspective, read and understand what comes out with your insurance, because it's on the AGM agenda every single year.
Yep.
From a body corporate manager's perspective, whatever you apply for or don't apply for, you absolutely need instructions from your committee, because there's always the assertion that we thought we were covered and we weren't, and no one knows who made the decision not to get or apply for a particular piece of cover. And I think from a committee perspective, be very cautious about making a decision without letting owners know to exclude some cover. So if you think, for example, that particular type of cover for that incident is too expensive, or we don't want to do it, or whatever, don't just you make that decision. To me, that's a much safer way to do it, is to put it up on the agenda for the AGM and ask owners to sanction it, confirm it, ratify it, whatever it might be, but don't you be making the decision on your own, because that's where the danger comes from personal liability and those things.
And Frank, I was just about to say, and especially so if your scheme is located in an area which is known to flood, except that in this most recent situation, areas which were not known to flood did so. So you can't even make that assumption, although it is fair to say that there are some parts, particularly in the southeast corner, which are very much known to be prone to flooding. If you're in those areas, if you happen to own a lot in a scheme in one of those areas, if you haven't already, you really need to be asking the question, looking at the PDS, making 100% sure that you are covered.
Yeah, and this is the preventative maintenance piece. So you don't have to make one of those tragic phone calls to Chris or myself after the event, to the extent there's another one. Yep. Understand what it is that's going on. And if you can't get the insurance that you're required to, you need to go and make an application for alternative insurance to the Commissioner's office. And the Commissioner, him or herself, will sanction that for you if you jump through the right hoops. So Chris and I have done webinars and stuff on that, so we'll put up a couple of links to the webinar we did about alternative insurance, the practice direction from the Commissioner's office about alternative insurance. So if you want more of that, watch and read both of those things.
And that kind of leads to the next point, Frank, which is that in some cases that might actually compel you to look offshore for your cover. The instant you start to look offshore for insurance, you know that things are starting to get a little tricky and, dare I say it, a wee bit desperate as well. Frank, you and I were in a session about insurance at the SCA State Conference gosh, time flies, a couple of days ago. And I think the comment was made there that the instant you start looking for an offshore insurer, What can you quite recall what the experts said there, Frank?
They
About
see you coming a mile away because you're only there because you don't have a choice, which means that your ability to negotiate price is limited.
Which means that we're talking now. Remember, we're talking now about planning and trying to anticipate. If that's where you start to find yourself, then adjustments might have to be made to budget. And we come back also to that alternative insurance question, because an offshore policy may not get you everything that you have to be covered for.
And may be prohibitively expensive, which are the magic words.
Yep, exactly. As Frank said, there's been a separate webinar on that one, so stay tuned to see how that pans out. What else, Frank? I think one of the other big things about planning, this is the before stage, everybody, is maintenance, isn't it?
Yeah. Insurers are definitely asking more questions than they ever have about buildings, which potentially informs them about their risk of exposure to a claim. So, for example, if a building has a leaky roof and it's had a leaky roof for years and the body corporate's done nothing about it, then the questions that you answer on the application for that insurance are probably going to relate to, have you got existing building defects? And if you have got a leaky roof and you haven't fixed that leaky roof, the insurer may price the policy differently, will price the policy differently, reframe that, or may not cover you at all or exclude rainwater damage, for example. So it's the lesson from that: get ahead of the issues in relation to maintenance.
And let's remember, Frank, that when it comes to maintenance and the body corporate's responsibility to maintain common property, it's not a maybe, it's not a possibly, it's not when we have some more money or the budget is looking healthier. It's confirmed in legislation and through case law that it doesn't matter if the body corporate doesn't have the money. It doesn't matter if it's going to be expensive, and it doesn't matter if people don't want to do it. Tough. Has to be done.
Yeah. The story. So yeah, don't shortcut there, because the insurers are definitely looking at that. And from a legal perspective, I don't do much Latin, but uberime fide, you've got a duty of utmost good faith, both insureds and insurers to the other. And really, from an insured perspective, that means you've got an obligation to disclose to an insurer any issues that might be relevant to their decision to insure you. So you can see after recent events, there are likely to be more questions and more obligations and more difficulties getting insurance where you haven't maintained your property the way you should.
In fact, the big one there is unapproved improvements. So if you've got lot owners who have a number of lots have made improvements and they haven't been approved and they haven't gotten council approval either, that probably renders that building at grave danger of not being reinsured, I would suggest. And Frank, we can't talk about the before aspect without touching just quickly on Northern Australia and North Queensland in particular, which is facing its own very specific challenges about the before, if you like.
And I believe you presented to the Senate this last week.
I did indeed, yes. Yes, so just for everybody's information, there's a reinsurance pool for Northern Australia, which is North Queensland and bits of WA, effectively, also Northern Territory, I guess. And yes, the Senate had a hearing into that. I appeared at that in my capacity as Vice President of SCA. Good hearing. The big thing to emerge from that was to reinforce the point that strata schemes do not have an option to not be insured. And that's a really important point to make to government decision makers, that this is not like owning a home where you can volunteer, or not volunteer, but where you can elect to not get cover. That's not the case.
Yep, absolutely. So I suppose really the before element then, if you're going to summarize it, is know what your insurance is and make sure you understand what you are covered and not covered for, and make sure that to the extent that you can, your building is maintained to the greatest possible degree, certainly to the statutory standard, that there's no defects, there's no things that are likely to contribute to an increased risk for the insurer. You tick those two boxes, and there's some programs, even Chris, I think up in North Queensland, JCU was running a resilience project for Strata to come along and help them to understand how they might reduce their risk in terms of a cyclone?
That's right, Frank. Part of the hearing this week was also about a widening and a more resourcing for those kinds of schemes as well. So it's definitely on the agenda. I just want to acknowledge Julia, as always. Thanks, Julia, for tuning in. You've posed both a statement and a query there, which is very relevant to what we were just talking about. We'll hold off on that one to the end because I think it raises a point that everybody's going to be interested in. So we will get to that one, Julia. All right, let's talk about the jeering. And Frank, this is really not Strata stuff per se, although I know you've had a couple of Strata related queries.
Yeah.
I've had one or two as well about this one. So this is what happens in a Strata scheme when the natural disaster, and we'll contextualise it as floods perhaps for the purposes of the discussion. I think the first thing to say here is just because it's a Strata scheme doesn't mean suddenly everything's magically different. You are in the same boat. We've heard that expression so many times over the last few years. You are in the same boat as everybody else, and so you should be following the same instructions as everybody else. So if you've got instructions about evacuation or mitigation or getting out of the premises or whatever the case may be from the relevant authorities, listen to those. Follow advice.
Yeah, and like one of the ones I dealt with recently was sort of a committee for a building that didn't have lifts or electricity still a couple of days after an incident. Can we tell everyone to move out? And my response to that is, well, really, it's not for the committee to decide to tell people to leave their homes. It's for the government and the local authorities. So those are the people that make the decisions. And then where we got to with that is there might be a lack of electricity or lifts for a period of time. So what the committee should be doing is just telling people what's going on. So it's a little bit after the event. In the maelstrom, for want of a better phrase, it's one of those things, everyone's under the same pressure. You know, your body corporate manager, your resident manager, if you've got one, your committee members, your fellow lot owners. So at that stage, I think it's a matter of certainly being conscious of that, recognising that, and doing your best just to get through it. And I think probably the other Strata thing that I think help one committee with is to the extent that you can mitigate some of the damage without exposing yourself to risk, as simple as maybe putting a tarp over something to prevent rain getting through or whatever it might be, then absolutely do that. Don't leave it go and say the insurer will cover it, because I can tell you now, if you can reduce the damage, it's going to reduce the headaches after the event. So if
having said all of that, sorry, Frank, I was just going to say, having said all of that, don't be a hero and don't start doing things that you're not qualified to do. That's a big no. And if I can, I'm just going to introduce the human element to all of this. Don't forget, it's body corporate and community management. One of the key words in that phrase is community. So you, whether you like it or not, or whether you think it's a good thing or not, being in a Strata scheme is being part of a community for one. I remember, Frank, I can't remember if you saw it as well, the clip during the Brisbane floods the other week of the high rise, which had come up with a method of pumping water that they'd just all gotten together and basically come up with basically one of those old Roman style aqueducts.
Oh, right. No, I hadn't seen that.
There was a clip of this, and I don't know how they'd constructed it or whether it was just stuff they found, and the water was flowing out. They had gotten together. Somebody had a bit of wherewithal to do it, all banded together and done it. Don't forget that human element, everyone. If you're in a Strata scheme, is your neighbour okay? Do they need some help? What about Mabel on level 3, who's in her late 80s, and you know she's got some mobility issues? Just pop your head in and make sure that she's okay.
Yeah, I think probably the other thing, there's no reason not to sort of take photos and evidence things as stuff happens. Because there's inevitably going to be a debrief afterwards. So understanding what has gone wrong and why, particularly in relation to rainwater, in terms of where it's come from and the rest of it, will make a heap of sense in terms of, you know, this becomes a cycle. The dust has settled, everyone's got back on their feet, we're going back to normal, we're looking at next year's insurance policy. What are the things we need to do or look at that went wrong last time that we can address? To the extent that you've got the time and ability and inclination to do that. And
just a couple of quick kind of Strata processy issues. If you need to seek an order for emergency spending because repairs exceed spending limits, you can apply to the Commissioner's Office. Frank, I think you said that you guys had one just recently.
Yeah, it's sort of a roof of a high rise in the city that was just not working the way it should have been and getting progressively worse. We got an approval for the committee to enter into a contract, have it ratified later on, I think to about $500,000 urgently, and the contractor was ready to go. So that was in less than 24 hours.
And you will find that if it's a genuine emergency, you will have those emergency orders turned around in less than a day in some cases. And the second thing to remember from a strata perspective, even though you are in an emergency, that's no excuse to ditch due process. That's no excuse to trash the usual process that you must go through. And that means making a reasonable decision step by step. Okay, admittedly, in those kinds of situations, things might not be as, how shall I put it, Frank, fulsome. Maybe you don't dot every I and cross every T, but you still do most of it, and you still don't make crazy arbitrary decisions.
And it's that communication piece that helps a lot with that too, isn't it? Just letting people know what's going on.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Keeping people informed is the best thing that can be done. Even if you don't have a huge amount to update on, it's always a good thing. Gosh, time is really flying by. Let's go to the after bit. So the natural disaster is over. What about the after? And Frank, this is largely about the insurance side of it, isn't it?
It is. So, and I think probably first rule of this Fight Club is lodge an insurance claim even if you're not sure. There's no reason, because the worst thing that can happen is your insurer will say no. But when you're talking about, for example, flood versus water damage, where did the water come from? This is certainly something we had a lot of issues with in 2011. What was flood? What was rain? What was broken infrastructure at that stage? There was a whole bunch of things lurking around. So insurance law is, like Chris, a bit like town planning. It's a very dark art, and to a degree, there's more art than science in it. And interpreting insurance policies is one of those things. So, moral of the story: lodge your claim, ask the question. You may get a portion of it back. You may get none, but it doesn't cost you much to have it ask the question.
Yep. I think we heard, Frank, at that same insurance seminar that we referred to earlier, that there was an instance where somebody had a claim refused, a strata scheme had a claim refused for flood, I think, and appealed. And there's a very specific process to appeal and challenge insurers' decisions. And I think it was 2 years later, Frank, their appeal got upheld.
And I know there's still some disputes going on in relation to Yazi, the one that went through the Whitsundays in the mid 2015, 16. There's still disputes about those things going on. So ask.
Yep. When it comes to getting the work done, so let's just say for argument's sake that your insurers accepted the claim and now we're up to the organising contractors stage. I think the first thing, Frank, is you're just going to have to take a very deep breath and be patient because chances are the tradie is going to be very thin on the ground, wherever you are, but very closely followed by you don't cut corners with that process.
And there's definitely some buildings that are suffering the consequences of poor decision making in relation to prior claims when insurers paid out. So what the insurer can do is they can go and manage the work themselves, or they can say to you, well, we think that's worth 40 grand. Do you think it's worth 40 grand? Here's the 40 grand for you to go fix it. If you just turn that 40 into reducing sinking fund and admin fund levies and don't do the work, we're back to where Chris and I started today in terms of what are the defects in the building that haven't been fixed.
Yep.
Because if you go back to the same insurer and they ask the question, what did you do with that 40? Oh, we just reduced the levies and didn't fix it, then bang.
Yep.
That's the stuff that's coming back to bite people now. So if you're given a payout, make sure you use it for the purpose for which it was paid out.
Absolutely. And then while we're still on the insurance train, I guess while it might be very difficult to turn one's mind to a policy when you're in recovery from a natural disaster, it's actually probably the right time to do it. Has the policy turned out to be fit for purpose? Do you need to make changes? Do you need to make adjustments? Is there a discussion to be had with broker? Is there a discussion to be had amongst owners and committee about that sort of stuff? That's the time to be doing it. Not a week before renewal.
Yeah, that's the terms and conditions, and there's so many panicked renewals where people aren't left with any choice you get ahead of it a couple of months out, you're going to be in a much better space.
Absolutely. Think about that mitigation. So again, I know that once you're in recovery from a natural disaster and it's not where your mind is necessarily at, but that's also a good time to think about future mitigation. What went wrong? What are you having to repair now? And is there a way to actually prevent that in future as well? So take the expert advice where it is offered, whether it be legal, whether it be engineering, whether it be building, whether it be drainage related, anything of that, insurance related. Take the expert advice. Don't put your bush lawyer hat on that one. Harking back to that community aspect, Frank, put your hand up, volunteer. The Mud Army had a very, very brief moment in the sun this week. But remember, if you're an owner in the scheme, you have a very distinct stake in its future. And if there is something that you can reasonably do to help restore the scheme, it might only be a small thing, it might only be a couple of hours, whatever, remember that your involvement in that work contributes to the value of your investment. So if you can put your hand up, put your hand up. And we have to say this one, Frank, don't we? I know you said this is not about ambulance chasing, but you may actually have to blame somebody somewhere.
At some stage.
And that's where the legal advice will kick in.
That's part of that evidentiary thing when things are going wrong. This went wrong. Is it a poor design? Is it poor building? Is it defective construction? Is it whatever? You know what I mean? But that's not what this is about today. So yeah, but record keeping is great.
Absolutely. That's the end of our kind of before, during, after. I want to get to some of these questions because there's a couple of good ones here. So Julia's comment, we have a long list of repairs from our insurance company that we need to do before renewal. The body corporate has voted to not do them, so I expect our insurance will not be renewed. I think that's probably right, Julia. Yep.
In this market, by all reports.
Yeah. So, and I think if I remember correctly where your building is, Julia, yep, particularly in that part of the world too. So then your follow-up question, what sort of liability do the unit owners have? Say someone is injured and we are sued, how do I protect myself from that exposure? Frank?
With great difficulty. So you've got an obligation to be insured. If you can't get insurance, you're off to the Commissioner's office to get that alternative application, but that's a committee level. So what can you do as a lot owner? This is where you might go and seek the appointment of an administrator to have the body corporate comply with its statutory obligations. And that happens. Chris, do you know anyone who could be an administrator to deal with those things? No?
Don't know anybody.
But you can appoint administrators overall or for specific purposes. And if the body corporate is black and white, not doing what it's got to do at law, then that to me, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that what everyone doesn't realise is that, not everyone, lots of people do, but if the body corporate has a liability for which there's no cover, the owners are proportionally liable in their contribution schedule, lot entitlements to whatever that liability might be. So if the body corporate's uninsured and there's a claim and the body corporate's adjudged to be negligent or whatever and has a claim of $1 million awarded against it, all of the owners are going to pay that.
Yep.
So I think really preventative maintenance from your end is that application for an administrator.
And probably the other thing, Julia, what's the implication for the loan owners? An investment that's not what it could be. And that's putting it in its nicest possible terms, I think. Glenno, as always, thanks for tuning in. Not strictly related to this topic, but kind of, sort of. Glenno's presented a scenario where debris blocks a sewer pipe that services only one lot. Debris entered from inside lot. Pipe's not defective. Who is responsible to clear? That's a pretty difficult one to answer.
And mate, I've had lots of those questions, and to me, it starts with, respectfully, what you've suggested as facts might not be facts. That's the issue. So there's lots of, and you get this with fire alarms all the time.
Yep.
It went off. It's like, well, does the battery work? Is the wiring loose? Is it too sensitive? Is it blah blah blah? So those things, proving that someone has acted in a way that they shouldn't be, is the difficult thing with that sort of stuff. So it's very hard to commit to anything black and white on a question like that without actually understanding what's going on.
I think, Frank, all I was going to say was, even when something seems obvious, rarely Rarely, is it? Sam, thanks for tuning in, and a really good question. If a building is class 2 but partly used for short-term holiday lets which were not originally approved, could an insurance company decline a large claim for flood or fire? And the answer is yes. And I think, Frank, we've heard of it happening.
Yeah, I think I'd probably be a little bit less equivocal, Chris, because the question is, what additional damage? So let's go back to what was the policy applied for? What were the questions asked by the insurer?
Yeah, okay.
If they didn't ask the question, then what difference does it make? And the question from the insured's perspective would be, what additional loss has the insurer been exposed to by virtue of those particular facts? So the flood or fire element, in terms of the damage to the building, to me, in a sense, is not necessarily related to the type of occupancy to which the units are put. Agree that it's a question to be asked, but I don't think it's an automatic disclaimer, as much as, Chris, I think some insurers are asking questions about, is there short-term or long-term only going on in this building?
Yeah, so that's probably where my sort of yes question came. I have heard of that, Sam, happening. Yes. So it's probably worth investigating a wee bit further if you think that your building may be in that situation.
And that is back up to that preventative maintenance one in terms of beforehand. What's the insurer asked? What have we told them? What's changed since we did our last policy for a renewal? What are they asking? Get involved in that process and understand it.
Absolutely. And if you're on the committee, even if you're not on the committee, these are the sorts of issues that need to be discussed at a committee level. Gosh, we have come to the end. Just a reminder, everybody, if you're new to the show, we live streams to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 o'clock Brisbane time. So to follow on Facebook, go to the Hines Legal page and hit the like button, an icon, and for YouTube, hit the subscriber button and the notification bell. One quick final question, Catherine, thanks for tuning in. What if the body corporate does not have emergency and evacuation plan for the complex for over 3 stories high? I'm not exactly an expert in evacuation plans, Catherine.
Hand on heart, I don't know. Certainly there's nothing in Strata legislation about the obligation to provide those things. There may be under fire and emergency services legislation somewhere, but I'm hand on heart, I don't honestly know.
Yep, that's a fair point. We've come to the end. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. It's a big topic, not a happy one, it has to be said, but I hope there's been something out of the before, during, after approach that's had some resonance for us all. Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Again, much appreciated for everybody taking the time to do so. Frank, enjoy.
You too, mate. Thank you, everyone.